Everyone who has just joined. We will just wait a couple of seconds before everyone trickle in. For anyone who would like this to be subtitled, please do enable the Auto AI plugin at the bottom of the screen. There's also a note in the chat about that as well. And while we're waiting for everyone to join in, you will see a poll on your screen, and we would love to hear your thoughts. So I'll give everyone a moment to answer. So the question would be, what are some of the biggest challenges you have found when outsourcing pharmacovigilance? If potentially you haven't been in a position where you were outsourcing the PV activities, what do you think could be the biggest challenges? And we've just chosen a couple of answers. So either cost, adhering to regulatory requirements, time zone differences, training and onboarding, or vendor selection process. Of course, if you think there's any other major challenge that we haven't covered, you could always drop us a message in the chat as well. That would be great. And by the way, the stats we collect during this webinar will be also presented in a white paper that we will send around afterwards. So all of your input is very useful. So I will let the attendees slowly sort of come in and vote. And in the meantime, good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thanks so much for joining, and welcome to an exciting event for BioTalent Social. You can expect an hour of a panel discussion with a live Q&A at the end of the session, and then additional half an hour of networking for those who wish to continue the conversation further. My name is Valerie Kalna. I'll be the host and chair for this webinar this evening here from London. And I specialize in pharmacovigilance recruitment within the pharma, CRO and biotech space. So this topic is very near and dear to me. And with me here today, we have four very special accomplished guests. So we have Kieran O'Donnell, who's currently VP of Global Drug Safety at Ariello. We have Dr. Tamara Herceg, who's EU QPPV at Amrit Pharma. We also have Nahed Souadkia, who's a pharmacovigilance manager at Clinuvel. And last but not least, we have Tamara Herceg, who's a PV quality and compliance manager at Aspen Pharma. So as you can see, we have representatives from both pharma and a CRO background as well to get different points of view. And yeah, we would love to make the discussion as engaging as possible. So if you have any questions for our panelists throughout the webinar, feel free to ask them in the side panel or in the Q&A section, and we will get through as many of the questions as possible, as I said at the end. And lastly, please know that this is also being recorded, and we will then upload it onto our BioTalent Social YouTube channel, where you can also access our upcoming webinars and podcasts if you wish to. So we have 36 people at the moment. So I think we could kick things off. Potentially, if someone joins in later, they're lost. No. So yeah, so I'd love to start with the answers from our panelists. Apologies, from the attendees. So again, the question was, what are some of the biggest challenges you have found when outsourcing pharmacovigilance? So okay, so one of the most common answers would be the cost. So 45% people think that it would be the cost, as well as adhering to regulatory requirements. And then we have time zone differences, training and onboarding, and the least percentage thinks that the vendor selection process is the challenge, which is quite interesting. So now it's the time to open up the same question for you, for the panelists. So what do you think?
I can start by saying it's always challenging to look at where we are outsourcing. It's a big plan. Usually it's a project in its own, looking for the vendor selection, making sure that you're selecting the right vendor, cost effectiveness, Definitely you're thinking about where the vendor will be established. So time zone difference is of great importance as well. But I think I will let Kieran cover more because he's more experienced there.
I'm surprised that cost. I presume that's high cost as opposed to low cost because it's a challenge. But as you say, cost has been the traditional driving factor behind outsourcing. At least it used to be, and it's always struck me as having had experience on both sides of the fence in as client and service provider. It's always struck me as a very difficult thing to actually quantify in the first place. Obviously there's a budget associated for how much a service costs, but quantifying how much that equivalent service would have cost internally is not an easy thing to do. So that was a bit of a surprise. And I was a bit surprised that the vendor selection process wasn't one of the challenges. Obviously it's never a challenge with Ariello, but having been on the other side, it is not an easy thing to manage internally or with the vendors themselves. So.
Yeah, 100%. I was also quite surprised about the answers. Anyone else has anything sort of to add, or anyone else was surprised by the answers that we got?
So just to add, and so as we all know that now CROs has become the integral part of pharmaceutical company, there is no way that you could avoid outsourcing. And the challenges from my experience, if I speak, and one of the challenges that I can see more than the cost, it is cost effective in my opinion, at least from my perspective. And the reason being, the pharmaceutical companies or the sponsors are looking for the CROs because they bring in more expertise and they come at the lower cost. And when you have to work your cost in outsourcing versus keeping the activities in-house, and most of the times in my experience what I have seen is it is most cost effective. Of course we have the pros, I know it comes with the cons as well, and the challenge could be the one of the transparency and trust between both the parties. So that's the reason. Obviously it starts with the request for the proposal. When you start having those conversations with the CR1, that's when you need to probably agree with the vendors in terms of the vendor selection, what actually you are planning to outsource, and is the vendor is really capable of providing those services that you are expecting. That is the one thing, and you just define those roles and responsibilities at the start itself. And probably the other challenge with the pandemic in the last 3 years, and we could see there is a lot of turnaround within the CROs as well as within the sponsors as well, and especially talking about the CROs, that turnaround, if I speak, is probably now we learned that we all can work from the home, and which is not the situation before. Like somebody is calling folks saying that I'm giving you, you can 100% work from home, and obviously I give you a salary increase and better benefit package. That's when obviously we tend to agree, and we are agree. And just that's the one thing, and probably adding in the recent past during the pandemic times to increase turnaround time. And so to combat this challenge, and probably when we are looking for the CROs, and we see the CRO with a higher retention rate, and so we ask those questions at the time of requesting the proposal and the requirements. That's what I could see. And then having the confidentiality agreement, that is the one challenge. And have your legal department review those confidentiality agreement. And because obviously end of the day sponsor is sharing their intellectual property and most of the confidentiality information with the CROs, right? And so I think that's all these points that you need to look as a priority at the start of initiating those conversations. And obviously the relationship is built with the trust between both the parties, and that's how you work together. And obviously that is success for the relationship in a long run.
No, 100%. You definitely covered a lot of points. So if we sort of pick out on a few of those, so you mentioned the vendor selection process And obviously, it was quite surprising that no one found that as a challenge. So, question for you, Tamara. So, not implementing the vendor selection process obviously can be detrimental to a business. It could result in project failures, cost overrun, and whatnot. What are the types of questions you should consider when choosing a vendor for PV?
Thank you, Valerie. So vendor selection process certainly needs to be in place, that's for sure. And I believe that the best way is to use vendor questionnaire for this purpose. And in this questionnaire, we should ask like some general information, like details of the company, organizational charts, giving the company structure, organization, and the responsibilities of key individuals within the structure, details of the number of employees in the company working for pharmacovigilance, details of the QPPV, of the deputy. Now, of course, describe mandatory PV procedures like management of safety information, MI, PQC management, literature search, management of periodic safety reports, so all pharmacovigilance related tasks, including KPIs, compliance monitoring, out-of-hours coverage. Of course, do they utilize a valid safety database? Do they have any outsourced PV activities and their own vendor management selection? Describe their quality management system, of course, and I will for sure ask also about previous audits and inspections, handling of any major critical findings and stuff like this.
It's definitely a long list that you need to consider. So obviously it's not an easy task. What do you think, Nahed? So like organizational parity is also like important consideration when choosing a vendor. So, what do you think they could do to help overcome the risk of organization parity, and like what do you think of that?
I believe for a company, you are looking for your match. So if you are a small company, you're looking for a CRO that's able to fulfill your requirements and your PV requirements, and that will have to be similar size, slightly bigger, slightly smaller. And in terms of one small company outsourcing to a big CRO, they might get lost in all their complex structure, complex procedures. So you definitely need to think about where I am in terms of size as a company, who would match my requirements, both pace, cost, KPIs, sorry, KPIs, delivering oversight, because at the end of the day, you will be overseeing, you are liable from PV regulation perspective. So how would you be able to oversee a big company, a big CRO, if they're doing it on your behalf? You probably, you can get lost there. And in terms of KPIs, it will depend on what the project is, what you are outsourcing. It might be very simple in terms of the number of cases processed, the number of cases checked, the numbers of medical review done, submissions. Is it actually based on timelines? So any PSURs, DSURs been submitted on time, that kind of thing. So the KPIs can be tailored to the activity, as well as the who's outsourcing and how can you oversee it. It can be done monthly, can be done over 3 months, can be on a daily basis if there is a need for it. For example, for case management, you might have to have that kind of oversight on the cases that need to be reported, submitted through the system, or submitted manually, or something like that. So there is a lot to consider when you're thinking about who do I match, who do I marry to in terms of a company and the CRO. And I'm pretty sure everyone has got their own ideas about which company or which CRO would match your company. So when you start your project, you already have that kind of idea of do I need a small CRO, medium CRO, or a big CRO?
No, 100%. That's very interesting. Anyone else has anything to add on to that, or anyone disagrees?
Sorry, I was just going to say that these are all tangible metrics or data that we can compare across from one vendor to another as part of the selection process. The one key factor that certainly when I was on the other side of the fence was really important in my experience was that of culture and feel. Is this group, assuming that you're not going to have a different group once the vendor's selected, but is this company or is this group, are they people that we want to work with? And that, the organizational parity that was mentioned needs to follow up with similar culture, similar philosophy. These are people that you're going to be working with, dependent on as part of your outsourced system. So making sure that you like them and enjoy working with them is really important. And that's quite an intangible thing to try to compare or measure as part of a vendor selection process.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, that people aspect is very important as well. Maha, you wanted to add something as well?
I totally agree with what Kieran and Nahed said. Just to take the point that touched by Nahed in terms of the size of the CROs in the vendor selection process. And obviously, in the recent time, I think there is a competition for the CRO personnel, like in terms of when you have a contract with the CRO, and obviously you expect them to work on your project, and in terms of the resources availability, that is the one thing. Obviously, if that is not, but in real time, that is not going to happen. And if the CROs, and especially big CROs, they are going to work with multiple clients, and obviously they need to share their resources amongst them. That is when, and so just to address that, to have a clear communication plan from the start itself, and just to define the roles and responsibilities from the team members who are exactly going to work on your project, and if they have the required capabilities, and ensure that everybody, despite of the fact when they join the company, they go through the same kind of training plan, so that there is no gaps are there, and in terms of either it could be the vendor SOPs or the sponsor SOPs, whatever could be, they all go through the same kind of training plan, probably at the start of their employment, as well as on periodic basis, whatever the agreement is there. Those kind of clear communication plan, and if they want to communicate with the sponsors, and what frequency are you looking at, what is the mode of communication, whether you want to communicate through periodic calls with the vendor set up on a regular basis, or you want email communication, and if the email communication is there, what is the defined timelines to address those things, if in terms of those things, if you are capable of put in place at the start itself, and that could avoid certain mistrust as well as the kind of thing and misunderstandings. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Of course, I guess in any relationship, really, if it's business or personal one, trust is very important, of course. So you have mentioned sort of, size of businesses a lot, and that it matters in terms of, outsourcing and vendor selection process. So like outsourcing PV has been described as a mainstay solution for small and medium-sized businesses. How can outsourcing support these businesses in ways that it can't, sort of support the larger organizations? So like, what benefit could outsourcing bring to the smaller to medium-sized businesses?
If I might take that question, and probably if for this SMEs, kind of small and medium-sized enterprises, and they don't have the in-house expertise most of the times, and they are kind of the start of the companies, and that's when CROs really helps in this kind. Especially CROs, they have the expertise in-house, and they could really target down the client needs, and probably somebody is setting up a company and they want to establish a pharmacy PV in-house. That is not possible for them in terms of bringing them. They don't have anybody to bring those expertise in-house. So during that, whatever the period that they want until they establish their own PV department, if that is the case they want to go, that's when CROs are, obviously they can help, bringing this expertise and work with the companies. And
I agree with Baha. Because pharmacovigilance system is a very complex system with the strict regulatory standards that require appropriate resource, knowledge, and experience, right, to develop and maintain the PV systems, which medium-sized companies usually don't have. Therefore, for them, it's much convenient to outsource PV activities to the companies that have the resource to manage PV system and which are specialized for providing QPPV services and have already experience in the knowledge that is required. So that is why I think that outsourcing is a mainstay solution for medium-sized companies in relation to the employment of the appropriate resource for PV. It is more cost-effective for them due to that reason. For larger organizations, of course, PV outsourcing can be more challenging regarding the oversight of the PV system, training, onboarding of new staff, etc. The challenges that we already actually mentioned. So considering the size of the portfolio, they usually have the resource to keep PV in the house.
And I think also just agreeing with both Maha and Tamara on another point, it's bigger companies tend to have presence in more countries worldwide. So they have affiliates or they have partnerships, and that presence will allow them to cover a lot more countries than a smaller company can do. And therefore, smaller companies tend to go for local CROs that can, or local agencies that can provide the expertise and the presence as well. So not just because they don't have the expertise, it's also because they want to be present, but they're not there yet to be present. Yeah, so
100%. So in a sense, it could help them grow. Interesting. So obviously you mentioned sort of the different countries, and at the beginning you also mentioned that the time zone difference could be a big challenge. So how can the time differences sort of impact the overall rollout of the PV, and what other challenges can there be when outsourcing sort of activities completely overseas?
If I can answer. So when you have the outsourced PV activities, you still need to have the oversight, monitoring the compliance and KPIs, perform the training, onboarding, monitor the deviations, CAPAs, and all other tasks. So the time zone difference is a big challenge for those activities, since you have just few hours. Let's say if we talk about outsourcing to India, let's say, you have just few hours per day when Indian and European working time actually overlap. So it takes an effort from both sides to schedule a meetings at that time, to have a free space, successfully met the deadlines and requirements. One other challenge that I can think of is the IT help desk support. Also needs to cover both time zones for the company. From other challenges, we already really touched the base from the beginning, the costs that can sometimes be higher at the end than expected. Vendor selection process that I would agree should be in higher rank at the beginning of this webinar agenda, because it can be a big challenge due to different cultures and expectations, as Kieran already mentioned. Training and onboarding as well, because sometimes it needs to be conducted online because of the time zones and the different countries, and through Teams instead of face-to-face on site, which often requires repetitive trainings from my experience and repetitions. Regarding training and onboarding, time zone difference is a big challenge as well. I can also mention the managing the team and personal performance indicators, if this is this structure of the agreement and outsourcing, because since usually team members have managers then in both countries, like in India and in Europe, both needs to be involved in the performance of the employees, which can be difficult, especially if both sides have, let's say, in-house HR person.
Interesting. What do you think, Kieran? Because obviously you're part of a very global company, and you do have employees, all over the world. So, how is that challenge for you? Do you feel any challenges?
I think they're not challenges for PV compliance per se, but logistics do play a very big part in making sure that you're able to deliver effectively and communicate effectively. I think Tamara raised a really good point about the IT help desk. If that help desk is only in local hours and it's provided in a significantly different time zone, if it's the vendor's database and their IT support, and if there's outage or downtime and you need access to a listing, or if you've got a medical query that your CMO wants to address, then that suddenly becomes really, really important. So, even we're not there yet, but even mid-size vendors have a policy of what's called chasing the sun. So they'll have resource in each significant time zone. So kind of India, Europe, and then US, so that at any point in the day, for any client, they will be able to have access to resource. But it's not an easy thing to manage, but it is really important.
100%. Yeah, we all know how IT issues can be a nightmare. So 100%. So obviously we touched upon like different regulations and like different countries as well. So what sort of needs to be considered in respect of like EU laws? And now that more companies are outsourcing to places like India or potentially US or anywhere in the world, what concepts need to be put in place to ensure that GDPR regulations are followed outside of the UK?
I think I'll be glad to take that point because I worked on GDPR for a number of years. So that's GDPR before 2016 data protection was there, but wasn't really in depth. So GDPR came in 2016 and everyone became effective everyone panicked because of the limitations. And I think I can relate to those issues, because if you have other vendors in different countries, so if you have to consider what is the appropriate mean to share the data. And we're talking here about any EU data previously, and now EU plus UK data as well, because both apply the GDPR regulations. So when you are outsourcing, you need to think about where your vendor is. Do they have an adequate mean for sharing? So are they certified? Do they have representative in the EU? Because you can't really outsource to a vendor who hasn't have a representative in the EU if you want them to process EU data. So that's definitely something to check when you're doing the vendor selection. So I think that probably will complicate the vendor selection a little bit if you don't have the knowledge about GDPR. And it means if you are a smaller company, you will need to have that expertise either in-house or again outsource the expertise of GDPR to someone who knows what they're looking for in a vendor. So for example, you will need contracts with clear clauses about which data to share, how is data circulating, who's responsible for retaining the data, storing the data. You need to know exactly how the data is stored, what is in place in terms of IT security, also business continuity plans, although it's not directly covered by GDPR, but you need to know if something happened to your data, can you retrieve it? That's one of the important elements of GDPR. How do you retrieve that data? And also if there is a breach, for example, so the data is exposed or you get a cyber attack, how can you cover that if the data is also in India and in the US and in a different country, Australia or anywhere else? So you need to have that clear distinction in your agreement with the vendor about which data is being processed, how, where it's stored, how it's secured, who's responsible for it as well, and ensure. So, for example, you would think the US is actually an adequate country to share the data with. The EU disagree with that, and the US, up until October the 7th, or I think, no, March 2022, they were not considered as adequate to share the data because of all the extra security intelligence that they perform, which in the EU point of view, it's too much. Yeah, it goes over and beyond the personal data usage. So be clear in your contracts when you're drafting your contract. Make sure you do the checks and continue to do the checks. So don't just consider the checks before you select, or while you're selecting a vendor. Also do those checks regularly to make sure that they are still compliant with GDPR. So if you've got any other.
So I feel like all the challenges keep circling back to vendor selection. So it is a very important point. Kieran, I thought you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think it was a really good summary. I mean, it's also important, as you say, to have the provisions for data protection and compliance covered in the contract. We have DPAs, data protection agreements, with all of our clients. And importantly, as you say, something that's often missed is the verification and the compliance during audits. So again, you need to follow this right from the beginning, from contract through to conduct and beyond. So it is a cycle of review and activity.
I can see Maha unmuted. Would you like to add anything?
Just probably we, as much as we keep having this confidentiality agreements, data protection agreements from the start itself, once you have the vendor selection, and it is probably important in my perspective, like to have a periodic audits, and that sponsor audits vendor on a regular basis. That should be part of it, and that is agreement. And probably you have your own QA department. Have those periodicity agreed with those as part of the contract itself, or if you think that they need not necessarily be audited on a regular basis in terms of the frequency, like annual basis, then if you think they are doing their job, and then you could change the periodicity with a mutual agreement kind of thing. So that is very important, because where you can see the gaps, and you can have those discussions with the vendors and see what you could do in terms of the training, or training on the SOPs and all those things put in place there.
Yeah,
100%.
If I can say, I totally agree with Maha. So you need to have the vendor audit schedule, and according to some risk assessment, perform the audits on a regular basis. And then if it's noticed, that they're not performing as they should, or they're breaching the SDA or GDPR, then those audits can be made often, and according to all deviations that you find. So audits as a pre-questionnaire that I mentioned during the vendor selection process, it also apply for the regular audits and actually checking the compliance.
Definitely interesting. So while we sort of covering the regulations and the challenges that brings, so obviously I do need to mention Brexit. So how have the effects of Brexit played a role in outsourcing PV? So would there be any obvious challenges or potentially benefits of Brexit, for like UK companies when they're outsourcing?
I think just to start off, I think there are significant benefits for people wanting to move into qualified person roles. There are flip sides and downsides for those experienced resources in the UK that were no longer able to be EU QPPV or qualified person following Brexit. And I think obviously that introduced a temporary skills gap, if I can be so contentious. But you know, you can't lose 70% of qualified persons and not feel some negative downside to that. So I think it's starting to stabilize now. We're starting to see much more experience in European EU QPPVs, because now they're gaining the necessary experience to increase their capacity and competence. So I think now the effects were a lot less than they were than the acute effects, you know, just after Brexit. So I think in the long run, it's going to be a good thing.
Anyone else agrees, disagrees? What do we think?
I totally agree, and probably before Brexit and QPPV, EU QPPV can reside within the UK, and now it changes. And when your QPPV needs to be in one of the country within the EU or EEA, and whoever is residing within the UK cannot act as EU QPPV. So those things, if the those services like QPPV services are outsourced to an CRO, and that is something, and probably a challenge that it come with it, and that needs to be agreed upon. And if that is the case, and how we are going to manage it, and in terms of where QPPV, EU QPPV especially based, and
100%. So Kieran, you sort of let me into that. So you mentioned sort of the like job shortages for UK essentially. So do you think that outsourcing might be creating or will be in the near future sort of shortage of PV jobs in the UK?
I certainly think it's getting harder to find people. I'm not sure exactly what the reasons are, or whether I'm just looking back with rose-tinted glasses on what it used to be like. But it is difficult finding the right candidates now with the right experience in the right location. I'm sure I'm not the only one to think that, but the one area that again, we get approached about quite a lot is the UK national contact person. Obviously, the EU QPPV can fulfill the role of the UK QPPV, but if they reside outside of the UK, they, you still need a national contact person, and there aren't many of them around. So that's one pain point that we get approached about a lot.
So I did actually have a poll ready, so just to see what our participants think. So because quite recently I've had many candidates spoken to me about struggling to find junior level roles on the current sort of market within the UK. So I was just interested. Sorry, Lucy, that's a wrong poll. Never mind, we could move on to that one as well in a minute. Perfect. So now I was just thinking if, our candidates sort of, or the participants think that, at the moment outsourcing is creating or will be in the future shortage of PV jobs, whether that would be, the entry level ones, like case processing, or just overall, any sort of PV activities. So, the answers are quite straightforward. Yes, no, maybe, or not sure. So let's give them a couple of minutes and see what our participants think, and if we're gonna have any interesting answers.
I think just to add to what Kieran said, yes, I can definitely agree that if you're looking for the right fit for your company, it's quite difficult. Don't know why, but there is definitely a lack of, I would say, attitude, PV attitude. Don't know if that's a word, but when you get candidates coming for an interview, you expect at least a minimum. So if it is a junior role, you expect a minimum. So things like they can differentiate what a serious case from what a non-serious case is. So I think what's happening here, and especially over the last couple of years, I would say after Brexit, there has been a big change in the PV culture in terms of the recruitment. So there will be either a time for big recruitment of junior roles, and then a gap, and then another time for quite a few roles here and there, and then a gap. So it depends on the changes that the companies go through. So you can't be 100% sure that it will cause shortage of jobs, because the landscape changes. Some big companies have moved into artificial intelligence, for example, in terms of literature and things like that. So that created a big, I would say, loss of expertise, because those the individuals that were in those big companies have been there for a number of years. And then they left, and then they either wanted to join to go back into data entry or data case processing, or move on to the next level. But when you are moving on to the next level, you need to bring that, you need to be prepared to explain what's the next level, not just be in your bubble about case processing. So that also, when you have a candidate, they need to think outside the box, not just come with knowledge from the previous company about SOPs. Think outside the box, think about the regulation, what's changing, what's the landscape like. Yeah, you need to be outstanding to be chosen as a candidate, right? So they need to bring that attitude to an interview.
100%. And that is actually leading me into the next question. But before I ask the question, we do have the results in. And yeah, so 55% of people that are watching us today do think that yes, outsourcing will be or is already creating a shortage of PV jobs in the UK. So that's very interesting point. But obviously, as you said, Nahed, that could always change. You know, that could be new opportunities on the market. So definitely it's worth keeping your eyes you know, on the landscape, and sort of, you know, be adaptable to what's currently going on within pharmacovigilance industry. So yeah, and I think my sort of final question would be, you know, for anyone that's watching tonight that might be considering applying for a new role within the pharmacovigilance space, or you know, is trying to get into the pharmacovigilance industry, what ways can they continue to upskill themselves to ensure to remain competitive in the market? So like, what do we think? What would be the, you know, most important sort of skills now moving forward, you know, PV wise, essentially? It could be technical skills, or if you have a look at the people skills, so, you know, what are the top skills you see being most sought after within drug safety market as we move into like 2023 and beyond?
I think I would add one point to what I've just said about bringing the attitude and the knowledge and things. I would also encourage people to look at the company. So when you're joining I would say CRO, usually you're joining for an activity, specific activity. You could be doing that on your own, not in a team, or in a small team, or in a bigger team. When you're joining a pharmaceutical company, it doesn't matter what size, but especially for those small and medium size, the right fit matters. So the hiring managers are not just looking for your knowledge or your education or your degrees, what you have, or your experience. They're also looking for a good fit for their teams. They don't want to hire one person and then lose 3 more because of conflicts or things like that. So yeah, also bring your personality, your team playing or team player skills to the team. Bring new things to the team to be a great fit.
100%. What do everyone else think? Sorry, Tamara. Yeah.
No worries, thank you. Sorry, I agree with Nahed. That's really a good point. People sometimes think that when they finish the education, that they need to be at some high level immediately. But in pharmacovigilance, to get these skills, you need to start from the scratch. So you need to have those first junior roles with the case processing. This is place when you are actually learning and getting your knowledge. From the other side, we spoke about this, the question that was for participants. I agree for the outsourcing, because I believe that the big companies sometimes are not ready for those junior roles. And that's why outsourcing companies that are bigger have many clients. They have more open positions for junior roles. And that's why more people go actually to, they are hiring more junior roles than a big companies. So maybe the big companies, big pharmas can also consider to open those more junior roles for people, not to just ask for so many experience and education and knowledge. That's how people are getting those skills that they can develop and work in the few parts of the pharmacovigilance to get more skills and to be more competitive for future development.
And I agree, Tamara. I think the one thing I'd add is patience, as you said. It takes a while or arguably takes longer, I think, in PV to rise up through the hierarchy of the organization. As a ballpark, I wouldn't be surprised if someone was a manager at about 4 or 5 years at least. And a lot of other industries, a lot of other areas, even within pharma, you can rise through the ranks quicker. So I think patience and perseverance is really important.
100%. Maha, do you have anything to add as well? What do you think would be the most important skills to have? Whether that could be, technical or like personal skills.
So I totally agree with whatever the other panel members said there, and in my opinion, it is the personal skills is something that adaptability to the new work environment, and it's a kind of developing those cultures, and that is, of course, the other things it can be taught within the organization through SOPs and the clear policies and procedures put in place, and that you can learn by training. But kind of adaptability and clear communication and just working as a team and respecting the team culture is something one need to cultivate. And as much as it is one's responsibility, I would also think it is the organizational ethics that they had to cultivate that within their employees, and that's something I would say.
100%. So let's have a look what our participants think. So I did ask them what are the top skills that you see being most sought after as we move into 2023 and beyond. So I think the clear winner here would be project management. So 65% think that project management skills are very important. And then we've had 59% adaptability. Which definitely, as we already discussed, is a very good skill to have as there's ever-changing PV landscape. And then also stakeholder management and communication skills, as we've covered, those are very important to have. And as the last is a data management, which is quite important, quite interesting as well. Only sort of 35% of people think that data management would be a sort of important skill to have. But to be fair, when you discussed Nahed, the sort of artificial intelligence, I would think that having a data management skills might be very important sort of moving into future, but who knows, let's see. So yeah, that was it. That were all of my questions. Unless anyone wants to add anything before I sort of say goodbyes. on the topic, of course.
Just one on data management. I think we're within PV and drug safety, we're living in a much more data-rich environment that requires much more, I suppose, use and adoption of data across different processes and across different parts of the business. So I think over time, certainly from industry benchmarking over the last 5 years, data management has become, and I think will continue to become, more important.
I agree, Kieran. Actually, I do tell my team that they need to understand the basics in PV to be able to move on further. If you don't have a good understanding of what case management is and data management, how would you understand where the data is in PSURs and DSURs and RMPs? How do you use the data? So you really need to have that solid background and then move on and then start looking for what's next.
Yeah.
100%. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for sharing your morning, evening, or lunchtime with us. Thank you to my wonderful speakers for sharing your insights, and also to our amazing audience for participating. It's been brilliant, engaging session. Thank you very much, everyone. We hope you can join us for next webinar, which will be announced in the coming weeks. So watch this space. And for those that wish to continue, as I mentioned at the beginning, we will have networking session. We've sent the link in the chat. So if you'd like to continue to the networking rooms, we will have some of our panelists there and you can live interact with them and ask additional questions, which potentially we haven't covered during the webinar. So please feel free to network and sort of come say hi. And that would be it from me. Thank you everyone for attending, and we'll see you at our next webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.